Well, I guess I decided to say some things in good faith to people of good faith and of bad faith. So, starting with, well, the obvious the emblems. I am surrounded by emblems, but you know what? I'm surrounded by emblems all the time, everywhere I go. Institutions of authority, people carrying on with activities where they play out roles, all emblems, emblems of meaningful behavior. Well, I prefer to surround myself with emblems that are meaningful to me. So, they represent things in my life, events, things I've done, accomplished, aspire to, and they represent things that can be decoded by intelligent people who are worthy of understanding those meanings. So, therefore, I'm not going to explain them, but except in that most general way. So, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's look at that in two different lights. Well, does anyone else wear or present emblems? Who doesn't? But if you want to be specific, look at the Pope. He's wearing some emblems, and big time, in a haughty way that is so extreme that, I mean, he could buy your house with some of them, if you have a house, which most of us Americans now don't, I'm sure. Looking at the issue from the point of view of how it could be seen as normal, let's just take Alex Jones. I mean, he's got the very nice, sleek businessman suit, but informal, no tie. It's a nice look in almost any setting for a man, especially in a city environment. And as a journalist who brings out excellent information that people need to know about, at least in some format. At least I got the news. I don't know how the internet topologies work to perhaps deceive how many, but it seems that if the evidence is valid, and it seems to be, at least a sizable proportion of the American public are aware of his existence and the things that he talks about. Without going into Twilight Zone narratives, though, it's still possible that with the right tweaking, information can be very strictly regulated over the internet covertly, in such a way that people can carry on believing scripts of what society knows, what society thinks, without that being validly represented in the media they digest from platforms like YouTube. Facebook was caught red-handed, basically, with InfoWars and Alex Jones suppressing information. I mean, it's always been going on in one form or another through criminal tactics, but the covert sort are the ones that are most insidious because they do the most damage, being able to go on the long run before being caught. He's wearing emblems of success, emblems of his values and professionalism, and that society seems to recommend and seems to be recommended to them through culture, which is often appreciably valid. I mean, there are other ways that it could be expressed. Those are things that different cultures appreciate very vividly, and individuals can appreciate them very vividly in different ways as well. Speaking of which, people in the world are carrying on with activities as individuals which they think are quite meaningful to themselves. They're quite, let's just say, aggressive about it. Protesters, voters, people who carry on administering companies as bosses. Some of them more visible to those whom they employ, and some of those who are far behind the scenes, usually the ones who are profiting most from all these ventures. And as I've already described in other videos, as Alex Jones and David Icke and Jeff Renz and so many others bring to our attention so voluminously and with such detail and with such dedication over such a long period of time now, there are very massive forms of corruption which exist as false norms in our society. In fact, they manifest as false norm creators. They've made a cottage industry that they've monopolized, telling people what's right and wrong, what they can and can't do, what bathroom they can go into, what emblems they can wear, what when and in what condition. And that's really society's mental disorder, generally speaking. But, well, with the history of how human beings have come together to create order since tribal days, and given the evil influences of nature and on this planet, as well as forces that are perhaps unseen by us yet present in very substantive and impacting terms, and are also sentient. Maybe the planet itself is sentient. Look at the cruelties that take place in the midst of what people call life, and then rethink whether or not the best ideals of human beings can be fulfilled under these conditions, especially when evil beings, through some human bodies, force humanity to be an auto-cannibalizing monstrosity. You can see that the hypocrisy gives it at least a chimeric soul that is so horribly demonic. It's just to say so horribly evil that since archaic times, people have avoided facing it directly and have misattributed it to the wind or to a force that's malevolent but difficult to locate. Maybe it's in another dimension. In fact, even if so, it's often manifest directly through people. One way that they conduct themselves to manifest this evil spirit, if you will, is by committing crimes. Of course, we see crimes being committed before our own eyes in some cases, but looking through the media, we get much more exposure to it than would have been normal without that media. But further, there are some people who've experienced a lot of it in some form, but not recognized it as such. War, in fact, is in most cases just a crime on both sides. But whenever it is truly one nation aggressing another and being unjustly trying to plunder and destroy the other, which happened to be a good society, when that happens, for example, in the persecution of the Gnostics and Manichaeans and various sects of Christianity, which now either no longer exist or do not exist except in spirit, those types of activities are actual crimes, and by one side seen as totally normal and totally right. Take the people who foment terrorism as well as those who conduct terrorist operations, whatever they pretend to be to our visible eyes. It's our third eye that sees them for what they really are, and that's the one that they pretend does not exist, pretend is blind, and would like to blind by the various means of chemical warfare, by which they assault our bodily and our spiritual health, to whatever extent there is either of those left in any given case or in any given group. Those people in those days, when we were first forming tribal communities, decided that they would use the tactics that are being used even now to create the same problems we're experiencing now, but they were in nascent form then. And this kind of organized criminal behavior always overtakes and tries to destroy a society anywhere it can, because even if you just take the laws of thermodynamics into account and think of human beings as a closed physical system and minds to be epiphenomenal, you have the situation where, in fact, given social order, there will always be entropy, because in all systems there will be entropy where there's order, and that will grind down that system to whatever extent it becomes a closed system. In other words, to whatever extent that it is constricted by forces which feed through it, or to whatever extent those forces are constricted or expanded. And when this happens, and this happens as a natural part of the process of growth of anything, including a society, And when those limits are reached, which bring out the worst in its organizational patterns so that entropy flares up in places, there's the chance that any given organism will just succumb to a kind of living death before finally turning into an ossified corpse. Well, that seems to have been what's happened on this so-called planet, if that be what it is, because it's more of a circus that's been expanded very far, and who knows what the actual shape of its substrate. Why call it a planet when the phenomena on it are so absurd? Who gives a damn what kind of platform it's going on upon? It's basically not the point. The point is what's going on the planet. I could care less what shape it is and whether it's floating in space or not, or who created it even. But getting to that in the future, I have a lot to say about who created it. I'm not a big fan. I know that there is good in it, but I think it was hijacked and counterfeited here. I don't even believe it had an origin here. And I define matter as being the local assemblage of the potentials for personalities to express themselves in common. And that local assemblage is terrifically fucked up on all levels for all intents and purposes of the lives of good people. And if you want to give nature a break and say that's really overstating the case, then well, let's take human culture into account and look at it in recent times, but look at it through all periods of history. You have people doing right, people doing wrong, and the people doing wrong have the control of society and culture and do not live up to their pretenses of nobility at any stage of its history, anywhere in the world. The exceptions prove the rule, and they're usually derived from what are really mislabeled the lower nobility, in other words, the knighthoods, the people that actually did the fighting and stood up for what was right in their own lives, and not usually the royalty per se, but in some cases, if there were any actual noble royalty, they were derived precisely from lines of knighthood. For example, before becoming a king, Clovis was basically a knight within the order of his family. The point is just that the pretenses of virtue in society are systematically, habitually, customarily, traditionally, anciently until now, and presently even more fervently and feverishly through the augmentation of technology and covert methodologies that extend its virulent corruption into every part of society and personal and private life. It's to the point where that development has become so absurd that the presentation of virtues through the emblems carried by institutions of authority, the presentation of propriety of public conduct and things like that, class, status, all these things have reached such a dissonant contradiction with what's going on behind the actual scenes, in which they're kept carefully hidden as possible. And I'm going to leave out the more esoteric technocratic methodologies like psychotronics, control grids, and just stick with the classical ones like counterfeiting and racketeering, as well as espionage and all forms of subterfuge and sabotage and basically internecine covert civil warfare and class warfare. Basically, there's always a tension by evil people to create a caste system which favors their perfidy. What would you expect? Now back to the metaphysics that underlie all this, which is to say that the meaning of things is not merely spectral and minimally dual. The meaning of things is precisely dual, where it truly matters so that there should ever be a conflict. In other words, we live in a world where things are divided. We live in a cosmos where things are divided ontologically between two categories, good and evil. And the relationship of those categories is ambivalent, which means they cannot coexist, which means that they are connected by a barrier of complete void. And whenever they interact, it can only be so that one ends up basically taking the energy of the other, and in the process, the loser is destroyed to that precise extent. And the interaction between the two defines the cosmos as domains of substance and annihilation, and quantum physics bears this out. Socially, if we wanted to even just keep the materialist paradigm in tow, that would imply exactly the social conditions of corruption and its envy and vengeance against good society throughout history, which, again, is the rule, and the exceptions bear it out. But to give good service to actual noble virtues and values is simply to disdain those types of corruption and never participate in them, not even on the merest pretense of it being in the service of the virtues that they also perhaps even do uphold, because that always tends towards corruption no matter what. People who pretend to have the right to do that pretend to be better than other people. And if you're going to really pretend that openly and be transparent about all your conduct. Don't be doing it in secret. That's also to say, do not be conducting subterfuge or any other kinds of espionage or sabotage inside the country against people who are citizens in it. And this is simply what is going on these days. There are two basic, I'm not going to get specific with the groups or individuals involved, but let me just analyze it generally. The good public does not engage in that kind of crap, and those who do and do it well pretend to be the good people and the best people in society. In fact, at one time, there were best people in society who had very prominent roles in it, and then the institutions of authority were built around their activities. That's a fact, archaeologically and historically. But those positions, of course, have been plundered and overtaken by criminals. And in fact, criminals are the ones who really set about institutionalizing those offices. Though really, let's say actually founding them into a bureaucracy, basically constructing them into a very opaque system of authority, very opaque regimentation of people and their roles, which enabled there to be a very strong distinction between one class of people and another, one caste and another, precisely on lines of who has the right to use force and possess the means of accomplishing that effectively, against the ruling class, which is to say the ruling class is defined by that capacity against another class which does not have it. And that's been the historical form in which authority was manifested in this world, which brings into doubt the question of its fundamental goodness. It's really a battlefield, not an actual home of life, but the battlefield between life and death. So these groups, of which I speak generally, are to be understood to be the corrupt and the just, the evil and the good. And of course the evil, the corrupt, they operate through covert means because they're essentially metaphysically empty beings. They're weak. They don't have life. So what they do is they commit crimes in order to satisfy their need for energy, because conduct which is proper with good people usually results in them being exposed and shunned. Whenever they get control of social mechanisms, they always use them as a way to systematically cover their evil intentions, which they eventually evolve into secret cults where they can have the full-blown activity in private while constantly playing mind games with everybody outside of that cult. And if they ever get control of institutions of authority and government, then of course they're going to maximize all social mechanisms in their favor in all the corrupt ways you'd expect from a technocratic, covert social engineering group of moral degenerates and idiots. You just call them exactly what they are. Moral degenerates, at best. We have a better name for them. I like demon. Demon captures it well. It's something worse than a wild beast. It shouldn't even exist. And it's everyone's obligation to see to it that they stop existing as good people, as citizens, as police officers, lawyers, judges, military men, all these esteemed and honorable people in those roles should be basically rounding these people up and throwing them in prison. Instead, what tends to happen is, because of the kinds of control mechanisms in place, people in those roles are usually restricted to doing what they're compartmentalized to do. And they're not allowed to actually find out what's going on and act accordingly, according to their best judgment and conscience. That's how it's systematically done. So basically, people who resent that, resent it by various degrees, and in various ways, according to their nature. But those who resent it most and have the most reason to are those who are most affected by it. People who actually are professionals in those fields mentioned. People who actually do the work they claim to do, such as in philosophy, in which I engage. We resent the arrogance of people who are involved in these criminal activities, even though we can't know at first that they're involved in them, because these secret societies pervade congenial private societies, which are not part of the mainstream culture or society, and are not presumed to be nefarious per se. And then what ends up happening is society is completely overtaken by a parasite, in effect, made more epic and virulent because of being distributed through more efficient networks of human action. And so advanced through technology and procedural ways of coexisting that maximize order and minimize entropy for all concerned, such as the contractual environment set up by our Constitution, and which is the best one that's ever existed. Given that situation, I have to speak to two audiences at all times, because in fact on the level of the internet and electronics and communication, there is the extreme likelihood that there are several layers of deep, dark internet which control the layers that are less deep and less dark and more available to the animals on the reservation and the public of upstanding people who might want to use these services. And what happens is that the breed of what we should call true devils or intelligent psychopaths are the ones who naturally try to wring the most out of a systematic criminal activity, which is all that can explain the insane, absurd, self-directed obliteration of American culture and society, and European, and it's all that can really on deep levels explain the insanity that's going on in various cultures around the world. It's already been said by others. I'm addressing a more general point without going on those rants. The general point being that in our society there is a great, in the society that professes to be the society of the American people, there is a great disease that has overtaken it and turned it into a virtual zombie. And it's basically controlled by a criminal elite. In other words, a parasite. And this parasite commits great crimes, just extreme crimes, again, and is treasonous to the nation and to all the people in society who suffer from them. The economy is controlled by fiat instead of by natural forces of economics. and that's represented by the policies of currency, which are in fact a complicated counterfeiting racket. And this is, of course, itself enough to represent the death throes of a civilization. But you know, that's a symptom, but it's also a vicious cause in return, in that it leads to the facilitation of all forms of corruption, which would have existed on a smaller scale if only we didn't have modern technology, and much more advanced modern technology covertly at the disposal only of criminals involved. And so, given this situation, you have a society now manifestly either completely controlled or almost completely controlled by perverts and cowards, and the will of which are enforced by fakes, tools, and miscreant thugs. And now what happens, though, is that if you keep your head down, keep your nose to the grindstone of your mental delusion, slavery, and imprisonment within an illusion of freedom, and don't ever buck a system which wishes to systematically ensure that you are a slave without knowing it, then you are allowed to continue on, maybe. But if you try to go against the grain of all that corruption, because you actually do want to express virtuous nature, like Socrates did, like others, many others who were in a very evil and cowardly way presented as scapegoats to deflect attention from those who really deserved to be ostracized, and yet who had profound influence over the mechanisms of ostracism in their societies. In other words, the perfectly unjust, they are a severe problem for everyone in every society, and especially in ours, given the technological, methodological aspects of the problem, of which I spoke generally, but which are thoroughly detailed in some of my videos, enough at least that you can find out more information if you would bother to research it using those links. But also, it's the work's been done for a very long time to set up these evil systems of control, and have been rooted in the ancient traditions of evil which have permeated human society. And so this is why while I admire Alex Jones's perspective on, you know, the idealization of a human existence in a world like this, which is so conceivable in a certain way. When I take it into the context which he knows of, and which David Icke speaks of as being so critical to understanding events, but he uses it mainly in the problem, reaction, solution context. I'm speaking of a larger context of analysis when I look at Alex Jones's ideals and say they don't really belong in this world. This world is inhospitable to that. Judging by the way it has decomposed so viciously, in spite of the opportunity to have upward spirals of prosperity and decency, because of what it's turned into, and what it's doing to itself so rapidly now, and so hideously. I don't see the evidence for that being the case about this world. But a battlefield between good and evil, it is. I think we can both agree on that, and so can David Icke. If he wants to avoid terms like battlefield and battle, he needs to stop battling people's arrogance who are stealing children from people in his country of the UK. And by the way, his emblems are kind of interesting. I think he's displaying his teddy bear collection. I mean, I'm not going to judge that. He lets you see his books. He lets you see he doesn't explain any of it. He doesn't even refer to it. But let's just say this. The important thing about emblems is what they mean to the bearer. That's the first and foremost important thing about them. they can't say anything about the bearer if they don't really mean anything to the bearer. And the emblems of authority of which I've been speaking this entire time, which are so absurdly contrasted with the activities conducted behind them as cover, I think have captured everyone's attention. So, to two audiences I must always speak. To those in good faith, I admire what you've done. If you've to exactly the extent and in exactly the direct proportion to the degree to which you've done it sincerely and without any nefarious relationships with the so-called powers that be, so as to enable you to do anything that you've done. Because if there are any strings attached, then to that extent, what's been done is really corrupted. But without asserting that, simply as limited by that constraint, I admire what's been done, and it has helped me, and it's helped many make better sense of the world in which they live, which is a very, very good service to have provided people. And to attempt to understand it is itself a service, and to struggle to understand it for oneself, to bring clarity to one's own mind and judgment, and propriety to one's action, at least according to one's best conscience and understanding, is admirable in itself. I mean, people who do that can literally do nothing else and perform a better service to society than entire industries. Because what's the use of mass manufacturing and more advanced toys to play with if, in fact, all that does is give malformed mentalities an opportunity to do evil all the more and all the more efficiently? So given all that, I admire those in good faith. But I have to say also openly to the cowards, the tools, the fakes, the hypocrites, the perverts, I despise you, and you are condemned to hell. And if in fact censorship has hidden my messages to the public, any of them, to any degree, to that exact extent, that is just further proof of their worthiness of that curse, which they brought on themselves by their cowardice and by their wrongdoing. It's just further proof. I'm sure that they're the ones who should be censored from being in contact with any emblems or mechanisms of authority or power in society. They should be the ones basically rounded up and thrown in the detention camps. I don't think that that's the direction that society is heading based on all the evidence. Therefore, I foresee its complete self-destruction based upon its conduct and the evidence. The evidence of history, the evidence of the current events going on now in the world, the evidence of my senses, the evidence of my intuition, the evidence of my life, the evidence of other people's lives, people's conduct, and so forth. So, because of that, because of the suffering that entails good people, who are a very small minority in the world, unfortunately, I foresee that a beneficent divine force will intercede by annihilating the world in stages. I foresee this as a metaphysical deduction proceeding from the evidence. So basically, it's going to happen in any form that it has to. It could happen in the form of an earthquake. It could happen in the form of a tectonic weapon initiating the earthquake. It could happen because it's overdue. It can happen because Yellowstone is just set to go, even if mankind were not present on the surface. It could be because mankind is what aggravated it using scalar interferometry. Scalar interferometry. So if that's going on, either way it's going to lead to the epic changes which will destroy all life on Earth, which it clearly deserves in either case, because in the first case, it didn't live in a natural world as a natural being adapted to persist through time past a certain point. If it lived in a spiritual world under those same conditions, it wasn't seen as worthy of intercession by the divine force. If, in fact, it did it to itself, then in either of those two realms, it has exacerbated its own problem and just added an explanation point to those two cases. If you needed more logical and evidentiary, uh, uh, let's just say, process in order to come to an understanding of the inevitable concerning this world, I don't know how it could be better provided. Um, especially if it's to the extent that I cannot reach two audiences, but can only reach one audience. I know that won't be the good audience because I'm sure it won't be because anytime there's censorship, especially covert censorship, that's an evil act, and that implies that it will not serve the interests of good people. Therefore, I'm only reaching the evil audience that has usurped control over the internet, and therefore I'm in an internet topology reaching only a scant amount of people. And they definitely aren't the good people, so they're probably, confirmed trolls. They probably even make a very good living off of being trolls, if you want to call it a good living. And who knows, some of them might be very local, and perhaps that's on a rotating basis depending on, where the targeted person is. Just trying to reach the people with truthful and good information who are themselves truthful and good. In other words, all the symptoms of the world and all the knowledge of the methodologies available to it for carrying out the activities which would explain those symptoms, in other words, corrupt criminal behavior, corruption of office and the criminal behavior that goes along with that, the criminal activities, the crimes committed, and the mentalities which go with this are all colluding to force that it is the induction to be very probable that in fact we live in possible worlds where the internet topologies are rather strict, and it's basically like a covert China at that. So it's ironic that Alex Jones was having an interview with someone who was an emigre from China, who wants to run for Senate. I don't remember what state, but she wants to run for U.S. Senate in that state, and wants to represent the interests of people who value liberty over prosperity, over safety, over security, to put it in the exact terms that David Knight used, which was very, very eloquent and cogent, as has his nightly reports generally always are. I really love the crew on InfoWars for my news. I like Real Ren's News. And I've mentioned all this in my blog, which you should look at in order to get all the links to all the sources where good information can be gotten, assuming that there's actually an open topology, and I'm actually addressing people capable of making ethical use of that information in the first place, which won't be disgusting, worthless, perverted slime, and will be people of good faith who are freely going about their business and chose at their own liberty to look at my video and listen to what I have to say. And whatever you think about me or my emblems, or even my way of expression, consider the facts to which I refer, and consider the reasoning that I've employed, and think carefully. And look at all the sources, not just the ones that I've referred to, and basically commit the act of charity that you would expect for yourself if you came up to me with your story. But also, if you're one of these hypocrites and one of these street acting criminal fools who's in on the perfidy, the royal scam, then go to hell, because you don't deserve any charity, and you're incapable of exercising it because you have nothing to offer. Me or any other good person, in fact, not even any evil person. You might be a good henchman for one, perhaps, but it's unlikely that talent, if any, has much of a shelf life. So but you know, to the people of good faith, you know, I wish you success and luck in what you're doing, and I hope that you continue to integrate the truth completely, and not to leave anything out unless it's for strategic reasons, but always in favor of its eventual revelation. I feel sorry for anybody that, for selfish purposes or for evil purposes, would ever leave out critical information about the corruption going on if they had a platform for reaching people who would be interested in knowing about that so that they could act accordingly. Um, and I would triply feel sorry for anybody that had access to that information and continue to act without courage and without honor by looking the other way, turning the other cheek, or in any way condoning it or assisting it. But you know, because whatever gain you think you're getting from that, even whatever gain you think you're getting, um, I mean, if it's a tactical measure in order to deceive the opponent, the foe, that makes sense. But you know, keep your friends closer, enemies closer. But if it's not that, then you're only hurting your own soul. And guess what? That's all you leave your body with. So on all those points, I hope I've addressed both audiences clearly. As I said in the ontology that I utilize, there is an ambivalent distinction between two fundamental forms of being, which are in themselves value-laden mentalities, rooting from minds which do not have a common origin, because a common origin means an origin held completely in common, and which completely accounts for both beings. And there are things which are in the righteous order of existence, in good beings, in divinity, which cannot account for evil, cannot account for its mentality and its conduct. Even if we go with the Augustinian route and claim that it is a lacuna in the substance, this is still contrary to God's nature according to him. Nothingness is exactly what God isn't. God is eternal beingness. He's taken the Parmenidean route, which Aristotle reconfirms in his metaphysics, and which Plato also establishes in his way, and which all the good philosophers and thinkers and spiritual contemplators and expounders of throughout history have done. And they have said that basically the divine being is eternal and laden with all the values to which a mind can aspire to have experience of and intimacy with: truth, beauty, goodness. And these things do not require reference to evil, nor is evil required for their existence in any way, shape, or form. It's simply incumbent upon good people, or in worlds where evil exists, to not lose sight of the fact that that ambivalent contrary phenomena does exist, in contrast with the world which they would prefer to focus upon and live in, and that they have to do something about it. So addressing those New Age idiots, who I've mentioned in other videos and in my blogs in the past, who keep on expounding that I'm arrogant for teaching what I teach and saying what I say, in sharp contrast to their evasion of same. I say they're the arrogant idiot fools, and Zen Garner, and if the arrogant idiot fool ever wants to challenge me, to some kind of public contest concerning that, I'd be happy to take him up on it, very much so. I've already challenged him, but he's too much of a coward to even address it. But, I mean, leaving that aside, basically, if that were allowed to go on freely and prosperously in society, which it isn't, in other words, if our Constitution were properly amended to allow dueling, frankly, instead of just contesting in various ways, then we would all be much better off. But that would imply that it had the honor to lack the degree of corruption it has. And given the degree of corruption it has, it certainly doesn't have that honor, but the reverse. It lacks it. Therefore, I don't count on there ever being much of a venue for handling disputes on such fundamental matters as the question of whether or not people are in a spell, inside a trap, and should be awakened from it, and in what way because I think that's pretty damn important. I don't know about New Age idiots. And I think it does matter whether or not you are addressing the matter correctly and using the right way of describing values instead of some relativistic bullshit that you dreamed up that should be better put in a goddamn self-help book in La La Land and then shoved promptly up your ass. But to people who I despise them, and rightly. But concerning those that I don't despise, those I take to be in good faith, which, for example, I really like Alex Jones. I don't know him personally, and I'm not acquainted with him. I met him once. I shook his hand. He seemed like a real person. He seemed like an upright guy. He peered at me in a way I couldn't understand or interpret when he passed by me out on Congress in front of Little City, where I was sitting and trying to get some peace of mind from my studies by reading a sort of an art book, a folio. And it was something that helped relieve my stress and take my mind away from my studies. I was a straight A student for 4 years at Austin Community College, and then I transferred to the University of Texas at Austin. And I took that seriously. I was given the money to go through 4 years of college by the U.S. government, by the public, because of my service in the Army as an infantryman for 3 years. I don't consider myself to have been in all ways the ideal soldier, according to most people who think of a soldier as someone who simply doesn't just obey orders, but esteems as his superior someone who holds higher rank, which I did not, and I wasn't at all pretending to do that, and never did. I esteemed officers, commissioned and non-commissioned, according to their conduct and according to their execution of their duties, and if they were unfair or acted like an ignoramus at any point, or were unreasonable in a way that had nothing to do with good order, but with just arrogance and just inability to control themselves, I despised them. And but I mean, I was young. I was 21, 22, 23, and I came to Austin when I was 24, and began my studies in college only 5 years after that when I was 29. I used the Montgomery GI Bill. And so in my studies there, I was very happy to spend my time working hard, learning as much as I could about the world, being educating myself, listening to the professors, doing all the work. And it was to the point where, not to boast, but at the end of every semester, I needed about a 60 on my final in order to get to get an A. In most cases, there were a few very difficult courses, and one of the most difficult ones was the art and architecture of ancient China. That was the art and architecture of ancient China. Good grief. That was the most difficult class I had ever. It's more difficult than Japanese and Chinese put together. But I mean, the point is just that I needed stress relief from that, and if I want to play a video game or read a Dungeons and Dragons manual, I will. And that's what I was doing at the time when he passed me, and he kind of peered walking southward down Congress with his companion. I don't know who the guy was. It was his friend. It might have been someone from his crew, but I liked him. I esteemed him, and I still do. I like his work. He can't be blamed for not addressing certain issues which are controversial to such a degree that it would probably lead to a complete derailment of his ability to present the information which he does. And the information which he does present, if followed logically and sensibly, can let each one reach their own conclusion about the stuff that he doesn't directly discuss, and reach a good one if they use logic and sense. And then they'll find out that actually he's not subverting the discussion of those things. He's by not going into them vividly, floridly, and constantly, or at all even in some cases. People have to choose their content carefully and meaningfully. And if others are already addressing it loudly, it's really not necessary for him to duplicate their effort. It's not likely he would have the forum that he does in some cases if he did. There's a lot to be gained from these venues for people who are honest and just want a well-rounded array of information to choose from when trying to figure out what kind of world they live in and make sense out of, especially in times like we're in now, where things are getting very critical and you need to prepare your souls for the eternity of consequences which must always befall people who represent themselves as human beings in a world and act either in accordance with what they pretend or with the exact opposite. So I do my best to come to an understanding of that, and always have, and to act accordingly. And to what extent I've been thwarted by organized criminals, I can demonstrate and prove empirically in a court of law. I know that will be prevented because of the outstanding corruption that exists all through our judiciary as well, so I'm not really optimistic about something like that. But yeah, and as things go with people like Donald Trump and others, it's almost like even if it were to go off well and be the best thing since gingerbread men cookies, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, if it's really what it seems to be, pretends to be, it's still it's like all those wonderful sweet confections that you can imagine, except as used to construct a trap in which, when you are caught, you will be baked in an oven by an evil old witch. I can't have much optimism about what he's going to accomplish. I mean, if he has to use populist rhetoric just to get people's attention, I mean, people should have been clamoring to get these issues resolved correctly that he brings up. Anyway, we're basically filling in a ditch and calling that progress, when what we wanted to do was build a mound. We're filling in a ditch and calling that progress toward that end. And then it's hoped by those people involved who are the source of the corruption and the problem which leads to this absurdity that people will be fooled into digging the ditch again and calling that necessary and unavoidable. With that going on, it's his rhetoric, what he talks about, the promises he makes, are fine and dandy. But that just brings us back to common sense and where we should have been since the 50s and never left in some regards. I don't expect that to happen. Where we're at now since then, as Eisenhower warned us we would be, as George Orwell warned us we would be, as Socrates warned us we would be, as Zoroaster warned us we would be, as wisdom herself warns us we must be, is in a state of near total, complete inversion, absurdity, and corruption. So, even granting in all good faith that Donald J. Trump is exactly who he projects himself to be, and Alex Jones, and myself, and anyone else, based on what we know contradicts that in everyone except these fine people and those who ascribe and subscribe to their same spirit, let's just presume all that. Given that, the dent isn't going to be enough to magically transform all this into what we all know it should be. So in that case, I'm reminded that we're going to enter a situation where chaos is likely to prevail, even if it's just nature pushing it past that tipping point, which would be poetic justice. And people are going to basically have to live out their final days, however prolonged, in a state of agitation, conflict, and misery, until all that is ended by the good judge. But I think before that happens, there will be a false judge who will try to take advantage of this circumstance. And I think people should be well aware that that could even be immediately after the expiration of their currently living corpses. So again, that spiritual preparation is essential in life, but also in what life becomes after its body ceases to exist in this form, which is inevitable even in the best possible world as far as I know. Even if we had a wonderful, beneficent utopia, seems that there are even roaming planets with evil parasites aboard that come to do their damage. So what do you do when you get things so nice that you don't even want to leave your planet or even think of it, and then one of these roaming planets comes along full of evil, demonic, basically spiritual viruses in physical form? You see what I'm saying about the cosmos now, and why in the Gnostic religion and in all true religion, matter in these forms are viewed as essentially evil, without acting like suddenly it's supposed to go up in a puff of smoke because I said so, but still admitting it for what it is, just like you admit anything that is evil to be what it is the minimum in addressing it constructively. You can't address constructively something you don't even admit is what it is or exists. Evil's greatest trick is to deceive people into thinking it doesn't exist, or that it is precisely what it isn't, or its precise opposite, ideally, is what it attempts to accomplish. It's done that in our world to a sufficient degree to fool most people most of the time. Even if Lincoln's generous dictum is to be applied, then we're in that stage where most people most of the time is the case. So the exception proving the rule. I am Afshin Najat, but I've always been known as Alex, and Alex Najat is my name. I am not the Gnostic Truth, but that's the name of my channel. I discuss the subject. There is a truth. It is the truth. And there is a Gnostic modality of it, which should be articulated. It should be understood and articulated. The protocols for so doing are completely open-ended, and certainly not up to the discretion of criminals involved in subterfuge, and they have no judgment on the matter. Nor do roaming idiots who are their tools, nor are people who are asleep and zombies, and really nor people who simply don't understand the subject. I don't claim to be the least grandiloquent or most efficacious expositor on anything, but I certainly do claim to have originated the knowledge that I presented according to everything that I've synthesized from facts, from readings and studies, from dialogues and interactions with very sage people and good people, and all my other conducts and engagements through life. And certainly it's only because I feel that it is appropriate and necessary at the same time. So basically, in this world, which I've described accurately, if not completely, but yet I think adequately for our purposes, it is an ambivalent conflict between good and evil, and it's all it can be, based on the evidence, and therefore based on the logical necessity of what we know to be the metaphysical deduction derived from it. And therefore, you should be on one side or another of a void. Don't attempt to be in the middle. Don't attempt to ride or straddle this conflict. You are prolonging it and destroying your own soul in the process, and you will be eschewed by the righteous and devoured by the evil. So this must be understood and accepted by all people of good conscience. And they must be cognizant of what's going on in the world that justifies what I've said, instead of burying their heads in the sand of dogma, what their family or their immediate community has taught them or forced them not to learn. Whatever your physical mind, your ego mind has taught you is the case, it's absolutely wrong and idiotic and damaging to your soul to believe it if it says anything like good and evil come from the same source, or they're just different points of view, or they're just evil's just an illusion projected by people who failed to see enough of the good, and so on and so forth. Which is why I've been so disdainful and aggressive in my speech and in my writings about people like that, especially when they put their asinine views out as if they were some kind of collective hierophant. Well, I would never claim to be that, nor priest of any kind, but I am always amused and disgusted at these hypocrites when they try to project their arrogance onto me. And as I've said, I know there are remedies for that which are unfortunately excluded from our society. But for all the people of good faith, I esteem you and I recommend you and I hope the best for you, and I wish that in the best possible world that can be accessed from this one, that you will be received, and myself also.